When Mark Sanderson announced that Jehovah's Witnesses could give a warm greeting to a disfellowshipped person, was this yet another Watchtower doctrinal flip-flop? Let's get into it. In the religion of Jehovah's Witnesses, what we know today as disfellowshipping, the very strict form of shunning and not speaking to the person who's disfellowshipped, didn't actually begin until 1952. Though the word was used, it didn't mean the same thing. As far back as Charles Taze Russell's time, and Russell was the first president of the Watchtower, he discussed disfellowshipping and avoiding of wrongdoers, but he did not include members inside the congregation in that group, and he mostly just referred to it for people who were untrue to God, who didn't believe in Christ's ransom, that kind of thing. Later, a procedure was implemented where the whole congregation got together and decided whether or not a person should be disfellowshipped and no longer viewed as a member of the congregation, but they weren't strictly shunned. Now, this was in following what Jesus prescribes in Matthew 18, where he says, first, if you have a problem with a brother, you go talk to him. If he doesn't listen to you, you bring someone else and you try to talk to him together. If he doesn't listen to either of you, you go to the whole congregation. If he doesn't listen to the congregation, then he is to be treated as someone of the nations and as a tax collector. And as you know, if you read the gospel, Jesus spoke to people of the nations and he spoke to tax collectors. He did not shun them, refusing to acknowledge them or their existence and refusing to speak to them. Jesus never shunned anyone in the gospel. And so Russell was basing their form of disfellowshipping on that. Both Russell and the second president, Joseph F. Rutherford, were pretty lenient with people who had doctrinal disagreements. In fact, they even said that the great apostasy that they claimed occurred was because people could not speak up against the things that they disagreed with. This is important, so I'm going to read a couple of quotes from the old Watchtower magazines that show this. The first one is from the April Watchtower of 1887, page 923. It says, rather like the Church of Rome, there being the religious leaders of today, their influence is exerted to restrain investigation within the sectarian limits. With the implied threat of disfellowship, they urge their ministers and students not to search continually for truth, but to accept the voice of their sect as infallible. So what Russell's saying is that they use that disfellowshipping, that excommunication type arrangement to maintain control and to quash dissent. Does that sound familiar? And he was very much against this process. And even Joseph F. Rutherford said something similar in the Watchtower of 1930, October 1st, page 301. Quote, Satan's organization sails under the high-sounding name of Christendom. It boasts of a membership of over 500 million persons. Its members are in bondage to creeds, customs, rites, and ceremonies. They dare not disown these or criticize or expose them. To do so would bring down on their heads taunts, reproaches, disfellowship, and persecution. Many thousands of the Lord's people are held in these denominations as prisoners, afraid to express their disapproval of the creeds, methods, and customs of the organization. I find all of that hauntingly familiar to the way the organization, which is what Jehovah's Witnesses referred to the Watchtower as, or at least they did in my time, or the society. Doesn't sound culty at all, does it? They do these exact things. They disfellowship people and shun people even for doctrinal disagreements. It says in the Shepherd the Flock of God book that someone can be disfellowshipped for disagreeing with Bible truth, which of course the Bible truth is what the Watchtower teaches. It's disagreeing with the Watchtower and what they claim Bible truth is. You can be disfellowshipped, which means you will be shunned by all your friends, family, and the other congregation members, treated like you're dead or like you don't exist. And you're actually kind of feared. It was hilarious. When I lived in Asheville, there was a woman, a sister, who literally ran away from a disfellowshipped person that they saw in a store, which I just thought was both hilarious and even then, as a full believer, just ridiculous. Like, why are you being afraid or acting afraid of this person who's been disfellowshipped? But it just shows the mentality of Jehovah's Witnesses in regards to how strongly they treat the shunning of people who end up disfellowshipped. So both the first and second presidents of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society in the pages of the Watchtower strongly speak against disfellowshipping people for doctrinal disagreements. But the Watchtower today is 100% in favor of disfellowshipping people who don't agree with their doctrines. They call them apostates. If you speak out against what the Watchtower says is the truth, you will be disfellowshipped as an apostate, and both the first presidents completely disagreed with that. But was it just new light? Well, let's get into that. We're going to keep going. There's a great JWFacts.com article that details all of this. I'll put a link to it below. In 1937, the magazine Consolation, which is what the Watchtower called the Awake magazine of its day, it had a great cartoon that shows a Catholic priest holding a sign in front of the church. And it says, excommunication, interdict, damnation, boycott, slander, inquisition, loss of job, etc., etc., etc. And it has a caption, speaking of the Catholic Church, it says, terrorizes its population and by coercion and tyranny forces it to bow to its yoke of servitude while prelates live on the fat of the land. And a prelate is a high-ranking Catholic priest, like a bishop. So they were hardcore against the idea of shunning and excommunication because they believed at the time that what that did was just quash dissent, and that's what caused the Great Apostasy. Even as late as 1947, the January 8th Awake, page 27, describes the practice of excommunication as unscriptural and even pagan. And it uses Hebrews 10, 26 through 31 to show that it should be left to God to judge individuals. And that's the passage that says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, and that God will judge his people. Now, in 1944, the procedure of having the congregation decide who gets disfellowshipped and treated like a person of the nations and as a tax collector, that changed. The congregation could no longer decide. Only the older men, they didn't call them elders yet, and the older men in the congregation could decide who was going to be disfellowshipped. And the reason they give for this is just ridiculous. It's in the May 15th, 1944 Watchtower. There's a quote. It says that the change is because the process described by Jesus in Matthew 18, quote, has served to cause more controversy and disruption among congregations in times past than almost any other thing, end quote. So they literally just jettisoned Jesus' prescribed way of handling these problems by taking it to the congregation because it was just too much trouble. Does that sound like an organization that's based in the gospel and trying to do things like the first century Christians and true Christians did, the apostolic way? Because Watchtower prides itself on being more like the first century Christians than anyone else. But as far back in 1944, they completely jettisoned Jesus' prescribed method of dealing with problems in the congregations. Now, in 1952, the Watchtower decided to just get rid of all of that nice stuff where they can still talk to people who are disfellowshipped. They just have to treat them like tax collectors, like people of the nations. They don't have close association with them, but of course they don't shun, and they can still speak to them because Jesus did. No. We're getting rid of all that come 1952. The March 1st, 1952 Watchtower completely denounces anyone who's been disfellowshipped. Let's read some quotes from it. We might wonder then, since this congregation which God is developing or bringing into existence is based on love, why anyone should ever want to talk about disfellowshipping or putting people out of his congregation. There certainly must be some reason. Well, the reason for disfellowshipping is that some persons get into this congregation of God that do not love Christ. It's interesting that they get to decide who does and does not love Christ and jettison. But let's keep going. Another quote. Such an individual has no place in the clean organization or congregation of God. He should go back to the wicked group that he once came from and die with that wicked group, with Satan's organization. Now that's just awful. He should go back to the wicked group that he once came from and die. It's in the Watchtower. That's what they said in 1952. Does that reflect the love of the Christ? Love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. Does it reflect Jesus and the way he treated people? Even people who were tax collectors, people of the nations, is that how he talked to them? And the final quote from that Watchtower, those who are acquainted with the situation in the congregation should never say hello or goodbye to him. He is not welcome at our midst. We avoid him. Thus the Watchtower set up what they now practice, the hardcore shunning of anyone who is disfellowshipped. But it's gotten even worse since then, which we'll get to. In 1955, the Watchtower in October 1st said that even someone who associates with a disfellowshipped person should also be disfellowshipped. What happened to not squashing dissent? What happened to believing that quashing of dissent was coercion and satanic and all of that stuff that they said early on? Well, that's gone. Must be the new light. But wait, because the flip-flop is coming. This hardcore stance was still very much the case in 1963. I'm going to read a paragraph from the July 1st, 1963 Watchtower, the article, What Disfellowshipping Means. Therefore, the members of the congregation will not associate with the disfellowshipped one, either in the Kingdom Hall or elsewhere. They will not converse with such one or show him recognition in any way. If the disfellowshipped person attempts to talk to others in the congregation, they should walk away from him. And this way he will feel the full import of his sin. So very much still hardcore in 1963 until all of a sudden, amazingly, in 1974, I don't think that was a coincidence, the Watchtower changed this policy. In August 1st, 1974 Watchtower, the article Divine Mercy Points the Way Back for Erring Ones. There's a subheading, Getting the Sense of 2 John 9 through 11. Let's read some quotes from it. Paragraph 21. In his second letter, the Apostle John gives the exhortation, everyone that pushes ahead and does not remain in the teaching of the Christ does not have God. That is not in union with him, has no fellowship with him. Compare 1 John 1:6. He that does remain in this teaching is the one that has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, never receive him into your homes or say a greeting to him. For he that says a greeting to him is a sharer in his wicked works. Do the apostles' words here necessarily apply to all persons who are put out of the congregation for wrongdoing? Or do they necessarily rule out any speaking of words of reproof or exhortation to a disfellowshipped person designed to move him toward repenting, turning around, and being restored to the congregation? By considering the context of those words of the apostle, we can have a clearer understanding of the sense of his exhortation. Paragraph 22. Note that in 2 John verse 7, the apostle says that many deceivers have gone forth into the world, persons not confessing Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is the deceiver and the antichrist. Then John gives the warning to be on guard and not to receive such ones into one's home, for these are active propagandists of false teachings, deceitful advocates of wrong conduct. They should be given no foothold from which to make further infiltration. One should not even greet them so as to avoid being a sharer in their wicked works. In this regard, we may note that the common greeting among Jews in apostolic times was an expression meaning, may you have peace. The Christians certainly would not want to wish peace to the man who was a deceiver or an antichrist. There is, however, nothing to show that Jews with a balanced and scriptural viewpoint would refuse to greet a man of the nations or a tax collector. Jesus' counsel about greetings in connection with his exhortation to imitate God and his undeserved kindness toward wicked people and good would seem to rule against such a rigid stand. So, major flip-flop here. Originally, from Russell to Rutherford, you did not shun people, even if they were put out of the congregation through disfellowshipping. You still could talk to them. You just treated them as a tax collector, as a person of the nations. Then, by 1952, that went out the door, and you absolutely had to hardcore shun anyone who was disfellowshipped. That continued all the way up until 1974, and the Watchtower says, no, it's only apostates that we should hardcore shun and have nothing to do with, which is what they're saying now, kinda. But again, they flip-flopped in 1981. The September 15 article from 1981, Disfellowshipping, How to View It, goes right back to hardcore shunning and even makes it worse than before. In paragraph 23, it says, "The apostle who gave that wise warning was close to Jesus and knew well what Christ had said about greeting others. He also knew that the common greeting of that time was peace. As distinct from some personal enemy or worldly man in authority who opposed Christians, a disfellowshipped or disassociated person who is trying to promote or justify his apostate thinking or is continuing in his ungodly conduct is certainly not one to whom to wish peace. And we all know from our experience over the years that a simple hello to someone can be the first step that develops into a conversation and maybe even a friendship. Would we want to take that first step with a disfellowshipped person?" Notice that the Watchtower flip-flops. They go back to hardcore shunning, but now they also include people who are disassociated, which means they just chose to leave the religion formally. So now you don't just completely shun the disfellowshipped people, you also completely shun disassociated people. And the reason for that is because there was a mass exodus from Bethel at that time when Raymond Franz left the governing body and left the religion. And he wrote a book called Crisis of Conscience outlining all of that. So in order to maintain control, which is exactly what the Watchtower used to accuse the Catholic Church of in their excommunication practices, the Watchtower now wanted to maintain control and quash dissent by making the punishment of even just leaving the religion just as bad as if you had been disfellowshipped. Of course, they offer zero scriptural reason for this. They just say, well, if you leave, you're now an apostate, and so we will shun you too. But it's all about control. And that's how it remained until recently, when the governing body member Mark Sanderson said in the recent update,
"The governing body has decided that publishers can use their Bible-trained conscience to decide whether to give a simple greeting and welcome a disfellowshipped individual who attends a congregation meeting."
So this new light is once again just resurrected old light. It's another flip-flop, yet another flip-flop by the Watchtower. When the Watchtower began, there was no disfellowshipping of congregation members according to the first president, Russell. Rutherford, the second president, continued this, with the Watchtower even calling the practice out as cowardly and satanic in origin, and they attacked the Catholic Church for it. That was the stand and continued to be the stand until 1952, when the Watchtower set in place a very strict form of shunning for people who were disfellowshipped. But they flip-flopped on that in 1974, saying it only applied to apostates, then flipped right back to it again, making it even worse in 1981 when they said, no, you should hardcore shun not just the disfellowshipped, but also anyone who disassociates or leaves the religion formally. And that's how it was up until recently, when now one of Jehovah's Witnesses can say a warm greeting to a disfellowshipped person who attends the Kingdom Hall. Does this sound like the organization of God to you? Does it sound like the truth that will set you free? Does it sound like Jesus Christ? Or does it sound like the never-ending flip-flopping of doctrines based on the commands of men? I think you know, but I would love to know what you think, so be sure to leave a comment below. Don't forget to like this video. Be sure to subscribe to my channel so you get my new videos as I release them. And as always, thanks for watching.